What up, Wizards? It's the Jill from Mtg down there. We like it in Magic. And today we're going to do something that we haven't done yet this season. It seems weird because we always do it. Crimson Vow spoilers are starting Thursday, like this week. Did you know that? It's crazy. They're starting this week. So we got to do the Innistrad Midnight Hunt standard tier list because we haven't done it. And I actually think still a good time to talk about standard. Like, yeah, previews might be starting this week, but we're still going to be playing this format for 3 weeks on MTG Arena. So maybe you want to know what the best decks actually are. So we're going to do that. But first, maybe you like and subscribe. Hey, will you like and subscribe? Will you do that? I need them sub sandwiches. All right, do all that, and then maybe do some of this stuff down here if you really feel like it. But there's a lot to talk about today, so let's go ahead, hit that list. Now we'll kick off the list and bring up the rear of C tier here by talking about Gruel werewolves of all things. That's right, they made it. They're here, but just barely, y'all. This deck has 2 4-3 records at Red Bull Untapped events and a 5-1 at a Saturday Magic, which is the deck I'm showing you right now by Shimmy33. And I gotta say, I am a little bit proud of this deck for actually making it onto the list. It doesn't show up everywhere, but it shows up just enough with just enough winning records to sort of be an honorable mention for this tier list. And I do think it's a deck you can go out there, win some games, and have a lot of fun with, but I would expect some losses along the way. All that said, though, the deck does have some pretty fearsome lines it can deploy. Starting on turn 2, you can go from Pack Leader or Ranger Class or even Kessig Naturalist into a turn 3 Tovolar or Reckless Stormseeker, and those are both good plays. On turn 4, you can play Arlen or Essica's Chariot, and again, those are both good plays. So you've got a lot of versatility, you've got a lot of options in terms of how you sequence your first few turns, and pretty much all the cards you can play on those turns are pretty powerful. And I like some of the stuff the deck has going for it too. Tovolar's ability to flip over and kind of Kessig Wolf Run, pump a creature, give it trample and all that, can bust you through stalemates against other aggro decks. You've got Reckless Stormseeker and Arlen, so especially if it's nighttime, you have a good amount of haste to get through control-y decks with a lot of removal, decks with sweepers and whatnot. There's just a lot of cool stuff going for this deck, but all the good tribal synergy in the world sometimes doesn't help you against broken cards and broken strategies, and that is the tragic story of Gruel werewolves right now. But I will say that Wizards has tried to support numerous tribes in the last few years, and it does feel like Gruel werewolves is closer than they've gotten to a truly competitive tribal deck in what feels like a good long time here. So again, you can have some fun with it, you can win a few games here and there, and even though you might lose a few too, you're gonna have a great time doing it, and that's what it's all about. Now, moving along here in C tier, we go from one tribal synergy deck to what is basically the ultimate tribal synergy deck. And it's a deck that a lot of people on Arena have been catching on to in the last month. It's been gaining popularity. And here on YouTube, for that matter, content creator to content creator, a lot of people are playing and enjoying this deck recently. However, it hasn't really shown up in a whole lot of tournament results, but we do have one big tournament result for it. Now, the deck you're looking at right now is labeled Bant Tempo, but make no mistake, Tulio Haughty brought a Bant party deck to a Red Bull Untapped event with over 1,000 players and ended up with a 10-3 record, which is really good, and I think much more than just the product of luck. Again, a lot of people have been messing around with this deck over the last month or so here, and it's becoming more and more of a known quantity in this format. Now, weird take here, but in my mind at least, this deck is the spiritual successor to the Rogues deck from last season. Concerted Defense and Spoils of Adventure are very much analogous in a lot of ways to Drown in the Loch and Into the Story to me. And you've got, even though most of them don't have flash or anything, you've still got a really good suite of creatures that can beat down the opponent in the meantime. Cards like Squad Commander are better than they get credit for, and Linvala is an absolute beast in this format where sweepers matter so much, whether we're playing best of 1 or best of 3. Jaspera Sentinel is already one of the actual best cards in the format, it turns out, and the fact that it has a party subtype Rogue is really important to this deck, obviously, but you also get Masked Vandal, which is every creature type and takes out Essica's Chariots. It's just, the more you look at the deck, the more it obviously lines up pretty well with what the format is doing right now, whether you have to counter that Grixs Epiphany with a Concerted Defense, or you have to squeeze through blocks and whatnot, or you have to say, that's Archpriest of Iona, by the way. It allows you to do that, or you have to go wide with a Squad Commander, or you have to refill late in the game against a mid-range opponent with the Spoils of Adventure. The deck just has a lot of angles to go from for what is effectively an aggro deck, but just like the Rogues deck of yore, it's basically a tempo deck. That's why Tulio labeled it Bant Tempo, because it basically plays that way, and it gets away with a lot doing so. Now, I guess what we'll call the best deck in the worst tier, and I feel like I have to clear this up every time I do a tier list video. If a deck is in C tier, it's not bad. It's not a bad deck. If it made the tier list, it's a pretty good deck. There's pretty good decks that didn't make this tier list at all. So, Simic Ramp and stuff like that, they're decent decks that aren't going to be talked about in this video like at all. Boros Aggro is Showdown of the Scalds. These are decks that we see on ladder all the time, but they didn't show up in this video, and they don't have a whole lot of tournament results to go by, so they're not going to be here, and they're good decks. So again, if it showed up on this list, it's a playable deck, and Mono Black is a pretty good example of that. Not the best deck in the format by any stretch, but we have seen a 10-2 at a Red Bull Untapped event, plus 4 different 6-2s at other Red Bull Untapped events. It's also done pretty well in Big Magic events recently. Not large-scale Magic events. The name of the outfit is literally Big Magic. So it's done pretty well in those events lately, too. So Mono Black Control actually has a real foothold in this format, but I wouldn't call it one of the best decks. Now, to clear that up, I wouldn't call it an S or A tier deck. There are only a couple of those in the entire format, but it is one of the better decks in the format, and it actually lines up pretty well in a lot of ways, right? You've got your 4 Blood on the Snow for the aggro matchups. You've got your 4 Duress for the control matchups. It's our best answer to Alrund's Epiphany decks and whatnot. We can also chump block really well with Eye Twitch and Shambling Gas, Skullport Merchant with a huge butt on, on its back. There's a lot of cool stuff this deck can do. And again, in terms of long game playability, it lines up pretty well with a lot of what's going on in the format, but it does mostly get smashed by Alrund's Epiphany decks, Duress or not. It's also one of those mid-range decks where you can draw the wrong half of it. You see 14 cards in a game, you draw a bunch of lands, 2 Eye Twitch, 2 Shambling Gas, a Skullport Merchant, and nothing to do with all your mana. No way to sacrifice the Eye Twitch, and it's just kind of miserable, but that's the risk that you take with most mid-range decks. You can draw all the dinky stuff. How many games have you drawn nothing but like Prosperous Innkeepers and Sentinels and nothing to do with all that mana? So it's not like it's an unheard of problem, but this deck does suffer from it. It's also a mid-range deck. And I'm sorry, but in a format with Alrund's Epiphany, mid-range just isn't super great, because Alrund's Epiphany kind of is a mid-range / control deck. It's just doing way better things at the top end at the end of the game than most other decks can hope to do. And even when you do resolve Blood on the Snow and you get back your Lolth or Onyx, it feels really good, but those just aren't great plays against the Epiphany decks, it turns out, a lot of the time. But you're going to smash most aggro decks that you come up against and win a lot of the other stuff. It's just the Epiphany match that's a real problem for you, and even mono green from time to time. But in most cases, this deck is going to destroy a lot of creature-based matchups and suffer a good bit in most others. But let's begin the B tier here, where I think there's a huge amount of separation between the decks that we just talked about and the decks we're going to talk about now. But that's what different tiers are for. So we're going to talk next about Teamer Treasures. Yeah, it feels weird to go from Mono Black to the deck that made the finals of the World Championships, but I think a lot of why that deck made the finals of the World Championships, because it was in such capable hands. Jean-Emmanuel Duprat is one of the absolute bottom line best players in the world, and he made a lot of really heads-up plays during that event. Now, that said, deck did well in that event, but it's also gotten 2 11-2-1 records, that's with a draw, 11-2-1 records in Red Bull Untapped events, and it's gotten an 8-3 and a 7-3-1 in other Red Bull Untapped events. So this is actually, and I keep bringing up the Red Bull Untapped events, but these events typically have over 1,000 entrants, and that's a really good sample size. If the cream can rise to the top of 1,000 plus competitors, I think that's a tournament you need to take note of. So I'll be talking about the RBU events a good bit this video, and that's because I think they're very, very important in determining these tier lists, but obviously other stuff goes into it. Now, this deck has gotten a lot more popular since Jean-Emmanuel Duprat played it to the finals of the World Championships, so we've got a fair number of recent results, but not a whole lot of results from before about a week and a half ago. So this deck wasn't seeing a whole lot of play before then, but Gruel Aggro was, and this is basically Gruel Aggro blue splash for counterspells most of the time. This version of the deck that's on your screen right now is just the blue splash for Disdainful Stroke, but sometimes that splash will be negate. Sometimes that splash will even be Test of Talents, because this deck has a a problem, just like every other deck, with Alrund's Epiphany decks. That said, this deck does have the ability to go underneath Alrund's Epiphany a lot of the time, and the deck is also able to get bigger than, say, mono white aggro. So the deck appears to be lined up pretty well, but every time I play this deck, it's a miserable experience. I'm not personally a huge fan of this deck, but I'm trying not to let that taint my opinion of it. I think all the decks that we'll talk about from this point on in the video are extremely powerful, well-known forces in the format, and one of them had to be the first deck I talked about in B tier. I mean, it's the B tier. It's a good deck. Temur Treasure and Gruel Aggro, by extension, are very good decks with a lot of amazing cards right now. The Jaspera Sentinel Magna combo is very, very real and can get you to doing some pretty righteous stuff very early in the game. I do like the theory craft of this deck, though, and it does teach us some of the things it's trying to teach us, right? Any deck that can turn 3 Esseka's Chariot in this format at least has a chance, and especially if that deck can cast Disdainful Stroke on Alrund's Epiphany, then it's really got a chance. Moving along in B tier, another deck you probably recognize, and that is Grixs Epiphany. It feels weird to have a Grixs Epiphany, an Epiphany list at all, this far down the list, but this is another one that we really don't have hardly any data for. Unlike Temur Treasure, this is a deck that some people have picked up, but not everyone has picked this deck up post-World Championships. I think that that's mostly a factor of the fact that Jean-Emmanuel de Prague got to the finals, and Grixis Epiphany did not do so well, especially in comparison to the Alrund's Epiphany decks that we saw in that event. So I can understand why this deck hasn't been as popular post-Worlds, but it does have some, sparing results here and there. A 10-3, two times at a Red Bull Untapped event, a 6-2 at another, and then a 9-3 at a Star City Games qualifier event. So it does have some pretty decent results here, and I think better results than some of the other decks we've looked at so far. However, one of the big reasons this deck is ahead of Temur Treasure is that not only is it a pretty good deck against Temur Treasure, but it also seems to do pretty well in the Izzet Epiphany mirrors a lot of the time, mostly because of its access to duress in most cases. This deck right here by Sir Hamilton that did pretty well, I think 5-1 at a best of 3 cup preliminary by Nerd Games, did only play the 1 duress, but sometimes you'll see up to 3 or 4 duress in these decks to either protect the Liar after it comes down, the Leer, whatever you call it. I think that this is a deck that could still exist without Alrund's Epiphany. I've always liked this deck because it's got the extra dimension of dropping Leer in the late game with 8 to 10 mana, because it can totally do that. And then just hold up your entire graveyard, right? Just hold up the Divide by Zero, hold up the Fading Hope, do something with them, draw some cards with the Behold the Multiverse, Soul Shatter something, just all kinds of interesting options once you've got your Leer down. There's a lot that I like about this deck, but it hasn't posted the good results, especially since Worlds. It hasn't really shown up as much as I would have liked it to, but I do still think it's one of the best decks in the format, and I think that Leer needs to be explored a little bit further because I think this is a very good card. But bringing up the head of the B tier is what may be a fairly controversial choice, but I'm going to make it. It's mono white aggro. You knew that you'd see it at some point on this list, and I was a little concerned about where to put this. I'm not sure that it's the best deck in B tier. As a matter of fact, I think all 3 decks in B tier are basically neck and neck. No one deck is necessarily better than the other, and of course, these 3 decks can beat the other decks on just about any day of the week, depending on how things line up. But mono white is definitely far more well represented than the other 2 decks in this format right now. It's got the much longer pedigree, for that matter. We know that this is a good deck. It's a very, very known quantity. It's sort of the mono red of this format, the known important, just all-in aggro deck, the fast aggro deck in this format is mono white. Now, in terms of results, it got an 11-1-1 at Red Bull Untapped, a 10-3 at the same event, a 12-2 at the other Red Bull Untapped event, and an 11-3 at the same event, plus multiple 5-1 finishes at various events like the Nerd Gaming event. So this has not been a terrible deck lately, but it has also been very well represented, and that's not always a good thing because a lot of people bring mono white to events and then scrub out of said events. This even happened at the World Championships where we saw a few players on mono white and none of them did very well. So my take on this, and again, maybe controversial, but I think that mono white is very good on the arena ladder where you come up against a ton of opponents in a day, right? And you can bang out games and whatnot. But when you play against world-class players at the World Championships, these mono white aggro decks aren't as good as they are on the arena ladder. That said, it is the de facto fastest deck in the format. It is the aggro deck in Standard right now. And I think that deserves a place of distinction because if mono white didn't exist, I do think the format would look different. Last thing I'll say here is that I want to note that the build on screen is not the kind of build that you'll see every day. Yeah, it's got Luminarch Aspirant. Yeah, it's got Intrepid Adversary, but you also see things like Battlefield Raptor, Cathar Commando, Star Pupil. Not every mono white deck is going to be the same, and that's kind of one of the beautiful things about mono white right now is that you can put, a bunch of 1 and 2 drop creatures into a mono white deck, and it's gonna work out most of the time. But what's the optimal build for mono white? Even after all this time, we somehow still don't know. And again, that's kind of beautiful. But I guess you could say that about our next deck too, the only deck in the A tier, because I do think this deck is better by leaps and bounds than every deck that we've talked about so far. It's more consistent. It's better at being an aggro deck than the aggro decks. It's better at being a mid-range deck than the mid-range decks, right? But it still has a fair degree of separation between it and the top deck. And of course, I'm talking about mono green aggro, or Stompy if you're an old soul like myself. Now, the list you're looking at right now is by Ryosuke Nishiura, and it won a big Magic event by 6-0ing in that event. But it also does have some other really good results. Obviously, it did really well at the World Championships, and a lot of people were on it, but it also got an 11-2, a 10-2-1 at a Red Bull Untapped event, and then a 13-1, a 13-1, and a 12-2 at another Red Bull event. So this deck has kind of been everywhere lately and producing some real results, and you can see why. But again, just like mono white, the true optimal build for this deck has not been found yet. And even at the World Championships, we have the best players in the world playing. The people that were on the deck were on different versions of the deck. Some people were playing Lotus Cobra. I believe Manfield was playing Lotus Cobra. No one else was doing that. You don't always see Sculptor of Winter in this deck, but PVDDR was doing that. So is Ryosuke here, but you don't always see Sculptor in the deck. There's just a lot of different ways to fill out certain slots in this deck. So again, the optimal build is not necessarily known or recognized yet. And I think that's again, especially for a deck we've been playing so long at this point, kind of awesome. But just every card in the deck is good no matter what cards you include, right? You've got Werewolf Pack Leader, Old Growth Troll, Essica's Chariot, Ranger Class. These all sort of form the basis of the deck. Plus, the 2 best cards in the deck to my mind, and that's Blizzard Brawl and Snakeskin Veil. These cards are just unfreaking believable. Snakeskin Veil especially is basically a counterspell that just wins games. It just wins games by itself. And then Blizzard Brawl is, a removal piece that wins games by itself as well. I mean, these are both just 1 mana to just make these ridiculous blowout plays and let you squeeze in a creature on top of that for the turn. So this deck just does so many good things. It does so many cool things. It plays the creature with the biggest stats every turn. No matter, what deck you might be looking at, what colors you might be looking at, this mono green deck plays the biggest and best creature every turn of the game for the first few turns. And those threats are so big that it doesn't really matter if you take out 1 or 2 of them. You leave 1 on the board and you're done, right? Even if you kill the Old Growth Troll, it comes back. Even if you kill everything with a sweeper, they might just resolve Essica's Chariot. And then suddenly they're right back on board with 1 billion creatures. So, if you're able to outstat them or outboard presence them, all it takes is a 1 mana Blizzard Brawl or a 2 mana Inscription of Abundance to just crush you. They'll even use Snakeskin Veil like a combat trick sometimes to boost a creature by +1/+1. They don't even care about the hexproof. It's just win this double block combat exchange and blow you out. This deck just has a ridiculous amount of tricks, and even though it doesn't look like much, and a bunch of creatures, just a bunch of creatures, it is way more than the sum of its parts. This is a very powerful deck with a lot of really powerful cards, and I almost put it in S tier, but it's not quite there. But I honestly think that even though I'm not going to make this argument, someone could make the argument that mono green is the actual best deck in the format. But let's get to the S tier, and we all know what it is. I'm super sorry, but it's Izzet Epiphany. Let's face facts. This is just the best deck in the format. Whether we're talking Izzet Dragons or Izzet Epiphany, and I think people are going to come for me for lumping those 2 decks together, but most results will lump those 2 decks together. Like this says Izzet Epiphany up here on MTG Melee. This says Izzet Dragons. But if you click on either one of them, you will get results that include both of these decks. People will play Goldspan Dragon in an Izzet Epiphany deck and just call it Izzet Epiphany. People will play 2 Goldspan Dragons and call it an Is It Dragons deck. So in a lot of ways, there's really no separation between these two decks, right? In terms of the deck that Utah played at the World Championship, it is a little bit different than the actual Is It Epiphany list you'll see most of the time. It played far more counter magic in the main deck, and of course it played those gold spans. But whether you play the dragons or not, I think you're playing the best deck in the format. Let me put it that way. Whether you're playing gold spans or not, you play in the best deck. All I'll say is that Is It Epiphany not only won the World Championships, but it also got a 12-0-1 twice in the same Red Bull Untapped event, 12-2 in that same event, and then 2 10-1s in that same event. In the other Red Bull Untapped event, it got an 11-2-1, an 11-1-1, and then a 10-2 twice. So this deck just gets not only winning records, but like 80%. 85% win percentages, like in some tournaments wherever it goes. And I think the deck actually sits at something like a 61% win percentage overall in tournaments in best of 3 right now. And that is an unbelievable win percentage if you're familiar with win percentages in Magic at all. The weirdest thing about this deck too, and the weirdest thing about the fact that it's the best deck, is that it's not even really that much of a deck. Whenever you're playing against it, it's one of the most frustrating things is that all the deck really does is stall time and suck balls for like 7 or 8 turns. Fade that guy, fading hope that guy, remove that guy with a removal spell. I'll counter that. I guess I'll divide by 0 that permanent you landed. I'll unexpected windfall, and then Orin's Epiphany win the game. Like, it's so weird. All the deck does is stall. It's like some tempo decks at least play creatures against you and get attacking or something, but like this deck rarely even does that. And it's just kind of annoying to play against a deck that doesn't even really have the decency to play sweepers half the time. This deck doesn't play that many sweepers. It really doesn't even play that many removal spells when you think about it. It plays barely any creatures. The whole point, and it kind of feels like Simic Turbo Fog back when Nexus of Fate was in the format. The whole point of the deck is to do literally nothing and make sure you don't get to either until they're able to resolve a spell that says I win the game. And that can feel more than a little frustrating, and it also feels like you're not really playing Magic when you play against the deck, but it is, again, undeniably the most powerful deck in the format, so it doesn't matter how weird the Magic it plays is. It played at Magic good. And so there's your tier list, ladies and gentlemen. In the C tier, Werewolves, Bant Party, then Mono Black. In the B tier, but no particular order, Team or Treasure, Grixs Epiphany, and Mono White. The A tier, Mono Green by itself, and the S tier, Is It Epiphany by itself. It looks like a pretty weird tier list, but I honestly think this is the way it shakes out right now. I wouldn't put decks like Mono White, Teamer, or Grixs Epiphany on the same level as Mono Green, but I also wouldn't put Is It Epiphany on the same level as Mono Green, just in the opposite direction. But hey, that's the list. That's the whole tier list. Did you agree with it? No, you didn't. I bank on that because comments bring engagement. So, although I still make these lists like as objectively as I possibly can, but I know that like no matter what you do, there's going to be people like you. So get down there and shake your fist at me and say whatever you got to say. And I'll listen. I read the comments and stuff. So get down there. Let me know how you feel about it. And yeah, Crimson Vow spoilers start on Thursday. So maybe sub. Maybe if you wanna like and subscribe. Hey guys, if you just wanna, will you please, if you like and subscribe, that'd be awesome. I would like you for doing that. What a good person you are. Okay, I don't know. I'm trying a lot of stuff. So like maybe ASMR is like a thing. Maybe we'll do like a whole ASMR deck tech someday. Where is that? I don't know how that sounds in your headphones. Is that a little better for ASMR? Is that better if I did deck techs with lots of vocal fry? Okay, I'm gonna stop messing around. But still, love you guys. I never know how to end videos, do I? Do this stuff. I'm supposed to tell you to do that stuff, and I didn't do that stuff. Support us on Patreon, blah, blah, blah. But even if you just like come around and watch for spoiler videos and stuff, that's fine too. I'm just glad you're here. I'm glad that people come by and check in on me. Anyway, I'm done for this one. Just let me know how you felt about it down there. I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, y'all. Spread love and be kind.